Hello and welcome back to Psychology 101. We are in week 2, and through these videos we're going to be introducing you to some of the basic concepts in Introduction to Psychology. Along with this, hopefully you're going to be reading your book and studying some of the questions that are posed in your text. So last week we talked a little bit about the presentation. Hopefully if anybody has questions about the presentation, I invite you to email me. Remember that your email address is bergs@sunysuffolk.edu. So please feel free to email, and I'll be checking that at least once a day. So I want to talk a little bit about a definition for psychology. I had asked you to, in your week 1, to come up with a definition for psychology. And I want to make sure that everybody is clear about why I'm asking about that. Psychology is a relatively young science compared to some of the other ones like physics, let's say, and astronomy. And somewhere in around the 1800s, it started to become a formalized science, and by that I mean the documentation began to exist. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that concept later on. But I'd like to talk about the definition of psychology. So make sure that in your definition you understand a couple of things. First of all, psychology is the systematic and scientific study of human and animal behavior. And by that I mean behaviors and mental processes. We are going to look at both. So why human and animal behavior? People ask, what's so essential about animal behavior? So behaviors, as a definition, can be anything that's observable. So a behavior can be eating, speaking, drinking, laughing. All of those are behaviors, and those are observable. Mental processes are not directly observable. Those are things that you can't see, like thinking, dreaming, imagining. We know that they are present in the human condition because we get reports about that. And we can have biological analogies to that, such as watching a brain wave pattern. So those things are not directly observable. That is, when you're looking at someone, you can't tell if they're imagining something. So those are two essential elements of our definition: behavior and mental processes, right? And also I wanted to accent the idea of animal behavior. So human behavior, it's obvious that our course is geared towards studying human behavior, and that's important. But I wanted to talk about animal behavior. Now, animal behavior is important to study for a couple of different reasons. One reason is because we do experiments with animals that ethically we couldn't do with human beings. So for instance, I used to work in a rat and pigeon lab, and we used to put them into experiments with bar pressing or key pecking. And we could deprive them of food if we wanted to see how they respond. We could put them in different settings, things that you couldn't do with a human subject in order to get observable behaviors. And so animal behavior is important because some of our important drug studies and things that we also study about emotion do come from this idea of animal studies. The second reason that studying animals is important, and this is something that's sometimes lost, is that we are part of a huge ecosystem, the planet Earth. And how animals behave turns out to be very important for us to understand. Early in our history, we've contributed, unfortunately, to the extinction of species on the planet, partially because we didn't understand the importance and why those species were so important to exist. We didn't have the knowledge or the study of their behavior to understand why they behaved like they did. And So because of that, we want to make sure that we study animal behavior to understand how we can be better neighbors to the people in the animal kingdom, animals in the animal kingdom. Sorry about that. So that we can learn how to fit in better on our planet, and hopefully it'll enhance the survival of not just our species, but also the animal species. One example I would give of this is that there was a study done about 15 years ago in the wild about observing elephants. And we didn't know, we knew a lot about elephant behavior in captivity, but we didn't know a lot about elephant behavior in the wild before this study because we hadn't had anybody that extensively had studied elephants. So we didn't know how intelligent they were, how communal they were, and it turned out that through this study, where a couple actually lived in the jungle in a blind area so that they could observe the elephants in their natural habitat. And it turned out we learned quite a bit about the elephants' behavior. We learned that they were quite communal, that they protected their less fortunate from predators, and that they had signals and different types of trumpets with their trunks for different signals of danger, of pleasure, things along those lines. So we learned a lot about animal behavior from that particular study. And with that, we learned how better to coexist in those types of environments. As our population grows and as the animal kingdom is challenged by things like climate change, it's going to be very important for us to understand and have the knowledge regarding animal behavior. And so I wanted to let you know that that's extremely important. What are some of the goals of the psychologist? Well, the psychologist has four major goals that they're aiming toward as a profession. First of all, they want to describe behavior. They want to describe the different ways that an organism behaves, right? So that's one of the things that the psychologist is looking to do. Second thing is they're looking to explain behavior. By explaining, we mean the explanation for the causes of behavior. Why did a person do that? And if you think about that, you probably have, on many occasions, tried to analyze behavior in your own right. Why did that person, cut the line? Why did that person cut me off in traffic? Things along those lines. That is something that we all kind of naturally do. And that's why many theories say that we're all sort of amateur psychologists looking for the causes of behavior. The third thing we're looking to do as a psychologist is to be able to predict behavior. How will an organism behave under certain conditions and situations? And so we're going to be studying that. Prediction is important because it helps us to then arrange our behavior in the appropriate way. For instance, under this category, you'd say something like, if you were going in for an interview, you'd like to know something about the company and the person that's interviewing you for a job, because this way you'd be better prepared. Well, it's the same idea with human behavior. We'd like to know something through our studies about the potential for human behavior given a certain situation, so that we're better able to be prepared for what might come about. The fourth concept that we're interested in is control. Now, control may sound like a scary word, control, but it's not control along those lines. Basically, controlling an organism's behavior can be done in a positive manner through outcome feedback, what we call outcome feedback. And that basically means that after a behavior, we either give a positive reinforcement or affirmation to them, or we give something more negative or a punishment type of feedback where we say, don't do that again, we don't like that. So we want to be able to control behavior for the positive, and we're going to talk more about how we do that throughout this semester. So now I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some modern approaches to psychology, to studying psychology. And these will give you some of the sort of categories where researchers plant their flag and try to do their research. So the first approach that I want to talk to you about in modern day psychology is the biological approach. Biological approach focuses on how our genes, our hormones, and our nervous system interact with our environment to influence learning, personality, memory, and coping techniques. So there's a lot of different things that biological approach looks at. Biological approach is more interested in what you're born with and how that influences your development. Second modern approach that we're going to talk about is the cognitive approach. Cognitive approach, how we process, store, and use information. How does this information influence what we do? What do we attend to? What do we perceive? What do we learn? What is it that we remember? How do we believe and feel about things? All of this is studied in cognitive approach, in our cognitive approach, thought processes. Third approach is the behavioral approach. Behavioral approach asks how organisms learn new behaviors or modify existing behaviors. And this depends on whether events in their environments are rewarded or punished. So we're going to be talking about the influence of B.F. Skinner, Burris Frederick Skinner, into the modern approach of behavioral psychology. Fourth approach that we're going to talk about is the psychoanalytic approach. This was the field founded by Sigmund Freud. So we're going to be talking about Dr. Freud a little bit later on in more detail. And we want to make sure that we understand the psychoanalytic approach stresses the influence of unconscious fears, unconscious desires, and unconscious motivations. That's very important. And how does this unconscious influence affect our thoughts, our behaviors, and the development of personality traits? What about psychological problems later in life? According to the psychoanalytic approach, your early life, even starting at age 1, will influence adult behavior. So we're going to talk about that also. The humanistic approach is the next modern-day psychological approach. Humanistic approach emphasizes that each individual has great freedom to direct their own destiny. It stresses a large capacity for personal growth and a considerable amount of intrinsic worth and a great potential for self-fulfillment. The thing that makes the humanistic approach stand out is that it's probably the most optimistic approach to studying the human condition. Some of the other approaches talk about us in a more bottom line way, sort of animalistic, if you will. The next approach, modern approach to psychology, is something called the socio-cultural approach. This approach examines the influence of cultural and ethnic influences and the similarities and differences between people on all of your psychological functioning, and how does this affect your social functioning in the cultural members of this particular society. The next approach we would talk about is the evolutionary approach. In the evolutionary approach, they ask the question, how do ideas such as adaptation and natural selection help to explain behaviors? So that's where they're influenced by the studies of Charles Darwin. The next modern approach that we want to talk about, and the final one that I want to give you today, is the biopsychosocial approach. This studies how biological, psychological, and social influences explain human health and illness. So this approach kind of integrates a lot of the other approaches we talked about into one field. As you can tell, none of these fields tend to be mutually exclusive. That is to say that just because someone is studying in one area, it might cross over into another area of study. But usually people within a particular school of thought keep to some of the same research types and protocols. So that's how we approach that. Now I'd like to give you a couple of the historical approaches, because the historical approaches are going to help give the context to where some of these modern day approaches come from. So some of the historical approaches, and I'm going to give you some highlights from each individual historical approach so that you'll get an idea of what things that you really need to know about that particular approach. So the first approach to historical psychological study is called structuralism. Structuralism looked at the structure of the mind. It's the study of the most basic elements of human thought. Primarily, they wanted to ask about sensations and perceptions, a section we're going to be talking about in our next chapter. So, what makes up your conscious experience? And the founder of this particular school of thought, structuralism, was a German psychologist named Wilhelm Wundt. And Wundt was credited with developing the first psychological laboratory. This was somewhere around 1879, just to give you a date context. And he used a technique called introspection. Introspection is a method of exploring conscious mental processes by asking his subjects to look inward at themselves and report what do they have in terms of their sensations and perceptions. So just to give you sort of a context for this, Wundt would take an orange and blindfold his subject and tell the subject to feel the orange, to smell the orange, and then obviously couldn't see the orange because they were blindfolded, but to report what the sensation of that orange was. Let's say the smell, the feel, the texture, those type of things. So that's the person that was credited with the first psychological laboratory, and again, his technique was called introspection. The next historical school of approach that we want to talk about is functionalism. Functionalism is the study of function rather than the structure of your consciousness. So there was that school of thought came about somewhere in around 1890 and was headed by an American psychologist named William James. And James was credited with formulating the first psychological textbook. This textbook was called The Principles of Psychology, and it was really known as the first acknowledged psychology textbook. You could probably find it used on Amazon. Just kidding. Most of the information in there has since been rejected as not being totally true. But there was an important contribution. This school of thought was interested in how our minds adapt to our changing environment, right, as we grow and develop. And the importance of William James and the movement of functionalism was that they helped to organize the concepts of psychology of the day, organized it into a text, and so that it could be read and presented in a logical manner. Even if a lot of the concepts in the text turned out to be not quite true, it gave us a format whereby we could do research and refute what was said in the studies that James was quoting. So that's functionalism. The third school of thought, historically, that we're going to talk about, came about in the early 1900s, 1910, 1911. And this was the Gestalt movement. Gestalt is a German word, and you might have heard it before. It's been incorporated into the English language. And Gestalt kind of means the whole, feel of the whole situation. There's not a direct translation for it. Gestaltists looked strictly at sensations and perceptions, and they two of the biggest influences in this field were Max Wertheimer and Kurt Kafka, also both German psychologists. And they actually emphasized that perception is more than the sum of its parts. And they wanted to study how sensations are assembled into meaningful perceptive experiences, right? So what does this all mean? Well, basically, it means that the Gestaltist realized quickly on that our minds tend to automatically fill in the blanks, right? So if you were to see a series of dots arranged in a triangle pattern, you would look at it and say, that looks like a triangle, even if those dots weren't connected. Why does this happen? Because as the Gestaltists found out, we tend to sum the parts into a whole experience that we can witness. And so this happens in a lot of cases. Many times we perceive movement when it's not there because our mind is tricked by this. So, why does our mind operate in this way? What is it about us that organizes things into uh, abbreviated forms, but we can perceive them? Take the idea of texting as a for instance. When you text, do you write out every sentence? I mean, maybe the old timers like me do, but most people who use texting nowadays will send out an abbreviated form of things. They might not use all the vowels, but yet most of the time people can understand exactly what you're saying even without the entire process. So the Gestaltists studied that and found that very interesting. The fourth historical school of thought came about in the early 1900s also, let's say 1913, was founded by a behaviorist named John Watson. John Watson developed the behavioral approach because he didn't like people speculating about psychology. He wanted it to be a harder science, something that was evidence-based. And so the behavioral approach emphasized the objective scientific analysis of observable behaviors. As I said, Watson started this ball rolling. Later on, B.F. Skinner came in and moved the science forward another leap. Psychology, according to behaviorists, should be an objective and experimental science with the goal of analysis of observable behaviors and prediction and control of these behaviors. So what you're saying here is that they don't want to make a science based upon behaviors that they can't see. So they left it to other areas to talk about those behaviors we talked about before that aren't directly observable, right? So they weren't interested in that. They just wanted to use and measure behaviors that were objectively measurable. Okay, we're back again, and we'd like to finish up today's sort of little recording talking about some of the potential for careers in psychology. People get very confused sometimes about the field of psychology because there are many different people who can practice psychotherapy, and so the titles attached to psychologists and to therapy can be very confusing. So let's try to straighten that out for you. So what is a psychologist? What is a psychiatrist? So let me go through that and talk to you about how we can sort those things out. First thing is a psychiatrist. What is a psychiatrist? Well, a psychiatrist is somebody who is a medical doctor. They are oftentimes involved in prescribing medications, and their training is very different from a psychologist. And the reason I say that is a psychiatrist has a 4-year undergraduate degree. Then they enter medical school like any doctor would. The first 2 years of their training is spent learning general medicine, the body, etc. And then entering their 3rd year, they will start to specialize in the field of psychiatry. And this would involve them learning more about the systems of the brain and the nervous system. They are qualified to do psychotherapy if it's something that they want to do. The reality is most psychiatrists, because much of their treatment is insurance driven, most of the psychiatrists nowadays see patients for a brief period of time. They do assessments and clinical intakes, but the majority of psychiatrists don't do psychotherapy attached. They are mostly involved in prescribing the medications. There are exceptions to that. Where I work in Pilgrim Psychiatric Center, by the way, the psychiatrists generally do meet with the patients individually, and oftentimes they have a group once weekly with them. But most of their job involves observing patient behavior and prescribing the appropriate medications and continuing to monitor that. That's a lot of times what the psychiatrist is doing. Psychologist works in a number of different settings. What is a psychologist and how do you become a psychologist? Well, a psychologist degree, there are a number of degrees available within the psychological field. Let's start with the PhD degree. A PhD requires 4 years of undergraduate school, and then you apply to graduate school. And if you get into a PhD program, generally speaking, that's another 3.5 years of coursework, and then there's internships. So the program takes somewhere between 4 and 5 years to complete, and then you have to defend a dissertation. The PhD is a doctoral license that allows you to sit for your license as a psychologist. It is also a research degree. So PhD psychologists can accent research, they can accent patient care, and there are other things such as industrial psychology, where a PhD person might also be involved in evaluating personnel, things like that. There's another degree that allows you a doctorate of psychology, and that is called the PsyD degree. PsyD is different from the PhD because it is a clinically oriented degree. That is to say that even though they do some research as part of their training, the majority of their training is in a clinic, and it does generally involve patient and clinical care. The people that enter a PsyD program are those that are generally interested in working in either a clinic setting or treating individual patients in some realm. So that either one of those are eligible for the licensing degree. For the license, and the license allows you to get reimbursement from insurance. There are several other degrees within psychology that are also licensed degrees. One of them is called a professional degree. That is the school psychologist degree. This training is a little shorter than the PhD, and it allows you to have a license to work within a school setting, doing a lot of testing, evaluation of students, etc., working with parents. But it does not entitle you to collect insurance as an outside provider to do private therapy. Also, there's something called a licensed mental health counselor degree. This degree is relatively new. It is a master's level degree within psychology, and there are a lot of programs such as this popping up. This involves a 4-year degree and then generally 2 years of graduate work toward the licensed mental health counselor, and then after their schooling and their clinic work, they tend to also take a licensing exam. Most of the time, this degree is utilized for either private therapy or working in a clinic setting or a school setting. Some of your school counselors at Suffolk are licensed mental health counselors. What about other degrees that might relate to counseling or psychology? One of them is the social work degree. Social work degree is a graduate degree that allows you licensing. There are a number of different elements of the social work degree. First of all, the training is a 4-year undergraduate degree, and then that is generally followed by about 1.5 to 2 years of graduate study. The social work degree is far more accents community mental health. So many times you'll find that someone with a social work degree is employed in the general public as someone who will help to facilitate the placement of patients back into the community, or working with the families and other issues of community mental health. The social work degree does allow you to sit for a licensing. It's a master's level degree, and you then can be eligible once you're licensed to collect insurance payments as a psychotherapist. the rate of reimbursement is not as high as the psychiatrist or the PhD psychologist, but it is on parallel with the licensed mental health counselor degree. So that's the social work degree. There are other degrees that allow you to do some forms of psychotherapy, but generally speaking, those are the degrees that we want to accent for purposes of our class. All right, I hope you guys picked that up from this week, and I will see you on the next video. Thanks.